everyone. My name is Graham Brookie, and I am the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. In partnership with our Global China Hub, I'm excited to welcome you all to the launch of our latest report, China's Discourse Power Operations in the Global South, an overview of Chinese activities in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, written by our resident fellow, Kenton Thibault. I also just want to take a moment to thank our other panelists for joining today's conversations. They're a collection of some of the foremost experts on China's strategy in the global information environment. And I'm sure that we're going to have a really interesting and fantastic conversation. The report itself looks at China's strategy to create an ecosystem of influence that Beijing can then draw on to enhance its power on the global stage. The efforts outlined in the report include media manipulation, political influence, and diplomatic engagement, as well as other tactics. The end result is to shrink the space for domestic civil society actors to engage organically in public debate, and in some cases further entrench and legitimize authoritarian regimes. The findings of this report serve as a starting framework to understand Chinese discourse power in the global South, especially its aspirations, its activities, and the actual impact of it on the ground. So to adequately meet this challenge, we require empowering civil society especially, and independent media, which is appropriate in the day after World Press Freedom Day, in regions across the global South who are on the front lines of this strategy of Chinese discourse power operations, and best positioned, quite frankly, to mitigate their impact. So since its inception, our team here at the DFRLab has worked with those civil society actors around the globe and worked to strengthen resilience against threats and vulnerabilities like disinformation. This report hits on many of the core aspects of our mission at the DFRLab, from identifying and exposing disinformation to protecting institutions and norms from those who seek to undermine them. It also supports the mission of the Global China Hub, the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which works on allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise by working across the Atlantic Council's 14 different centers and programs, including regional centers. With that, thank you again for tuning into this conversation, and I'll hand it over to Kenton to kick off today's event.
Thank you so much, Graham, and welcome to everyone who's joining us on Zoom. So as Graham was saying, this report focuses in on Chinese information and influence operations in 3 regions of the global South: Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. And specifically, we focus on what the Chinese call discourse power. And what this is, in China's view, is the ability to essentially establish the authoritative framework for how Chinese power, activities, and standing are viewed on the world stage. This involves the creation of new concepts and values, like a community with a shared future, as we mentioned in the report, and the redefinition of established ones, like human rights and democracy, to fit Chinese interests. It also involves spreading positive views of China, especially in emerging economies and the diaspora. And the end goal is to shape a world that's more amenable to Chinese expressions and expansion of power, and to kind of pave the way for China's rise. And in this report, we focused on 2 pillars of its strategy, which includes using international friends for international propaganda and borrowing a boat out to sea. The first pillar relies on essentially co-opting the voices of foreigners and foreign leaders to spread pro-China messaging. And the second pillar relies on using international platforms to spread Chinese propaganda in target environments. This includes expanding China's media footprint, conducting propaganda campaigns on social media platforms, and leveraging Beijing's influence to gain government support for its initiatives in international forums like the United Nations. And these are some of the activities that we cover in the report. The aims of these pillars are several, and they include fostering buy-in from leaders in the global South for Chinese-defined norms and governance concepts, to gain control over local media environments to spread a positive China story, and to further Chinese interests through regional forums. And in this report, we focus on 3: the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Africa, the Forum of China and the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States in Latin America, and the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum in the Middle East. We chose to focus on these regions in part because they each illustrate a different facet of China's strategy. Sub-Saharan Africa illustrates China's efforts to control the media sphere and spread pro-China propaganda, and in some cases, as in our case study, conspiracy theories. Latin America highlights China's diplomatic and people-to-people engagements through the International Liaison Department of the CCP and other lobbying efforts to achieve its objectives, including coercing countries to switch recognition away from Taiwan, diplomatic recognition. And lastly, a focus on the Middle East because it highlights China's efforts to undermine the appeal of democracy and take advantage of the decreasing presence of the US to further its own goals. Likewise, each country case study is meant to provide an on-the-ground kind of snapshot of some of the effects of these efforts. The case study of South Africa, for example, shows the phenomenon of what we call information laundering, where Chinese state media, through content sharing agreements, feed talking points to nominally independent news organizations. The one we focus on is called Independent Online. Independent Online affiliated editors and writers publicize these talking points in opinion pieces, then Chinese state media will pick these pieces up and present them as outside evidence to support their talking points, when in reality it all comes from one source, Chinese state media. The case study of Venezuela in Latin America shows how Twitter accounts connected to the Venezuelan state are affiliated with its supporters, spread narratives favorable to both China and the Maduro regime on Venezuelan social media while attacking the US and its allies. And here we focused on China's March 2021 vaccine diplomacy in Venezuela as a starting point to examine these trends. Essentially, we found that the pro-Maduro effort used a China-style social control program to reward citizens who inorganically amplified Maduro's propaganda on Twitter. And lastly, the case study of Iran shows how, as the coronavirus spread across the country, the Persian services of Chinese media provided extensive coverage of China's donations, including stories on the Red Cross Society of China dispatching testing equipment and medical gear to Iran. However, these public diplomacy efforts became a medium for influencing domestic Iranian politics and, to an extent, undermining the administration of now former President Hassan Rouhani by serving as a kind of point of attack or a vector of attack for hardliners. So in short, the findings in this report, as Graham mentioned, are meant to start as a starting framework from which to kind of understand Chinese discourse power in the global South, its aspirations, activities, and impacts, and to really start a conversation on these issues, or to continue a conversation. And these initial findings do warrant further research and call for a coordinated response to address this issue of protecting civil society in the digital age. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Caitlin so that we may engage in such a discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today to mark the launch of this report and to moderate what we hope will be a dynamic discussion and exchange on this topic with leading experts in the field. My name is Caitlin Deering-Scott, and I am the Deputy Director of the International Republican Institute's Center for Global Impact and the technical lead for our Countering Foreign Authoritarian Influence program. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for this portion of the event. Dr. Dawn Murphy is an Associate Professor of International Security Studies at the USAF Air War College. Murphy examines China's relations with the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa in her book, China's Rise in the Global South, the Middle East, Africa, and Beijing's Alternative World Order. The project is based on extensive fieldwork conducted as a visiting scholar with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, a visiting research fellow at the American University in Cairo, a visiting researcher at Stellenbosch's University Center for Chinese Studies in South Africa, in addition to numerous research trips throughout the region. Dr. Murphy holds a BS in Industrial and Labor Relations from Cornell University, a Master's in International Affairs from Columbia's University School of International Public Affairs, and a PhD in Political Science from George Washington University. I'm also pleased to introduce Pepe Zhang, an Associate Director and Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsh Latin America Center. Zhang coordinates the center's post-COVID prosperity portfolio, covering regional, macroeconomic, international trade and investment, health, and other key economic opportunities and issues in Latin America and the Caribbean. He also leads the center's China-Latin America portfolio, which provides timely insight on the growing relations between the two, multi-perspective and forward-looking analysis and events. His analysis have been published on outlets such as the Project Syndicate, World Economic Forum, and Americans Quarterly, and his English, Spanish, and Chinese language commentaries have been featured by US and international media, including CNN, the New York Times, Associated Press, El País, O Globo, and more. We are very pleased to have you all with us today for this discussion. As a reminder to the audience, we will leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this moderated discussion for audience questions. Please leave your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will do our best to answer them. With that, we are going to kick off the moderated discussion. So to start, what are China's goals for its South-South cooperation, and how should we understand these goals in the context of China's rise and ongoing geopolitical competition with the United States? So we'll start with Dawn.
Great, and thank you for having me here today. So in relation to South-South cooperation and the goals, I really think of this in terms of what China's broader interests are in the global South, and it using South-South cooperation as a way to achieve those objectives. So number one would be acquiring resources and markets. So a focus on South-South cooperation provides a lot of leverage in pursuing that goal. Another is fostering support for China in the international system. So whether that's in multilateral forums such as the United Nations, or if it's in bilateral relations, there are a large number of countries, 54 countries in Africa, many countries in the Middle East and Latin America, that China very much wants through South-South cooperation to have their support of these countries in those forums, especially as we are in a system of emerging either multipolarity or bipolarity. That's something we could talk about in the Q&A, but this is seen as very important. Next, they're using South-South cooperation in order to ensure China's own domestic stability. And what I mean by this, in particular in the Middle East, is to have support from countries in the Middle East regarding China's approach to domestic issues, in particular in relation to Xinjiang. So essentially wanting silence in many ways from countries in the global South, but in the Middle East in particular. Another important aspect of South-South cooperation broadly very much ties in with the long history that China has had in these regions, going all the way back to the Mao era, of emphasizing common interests with countries previously labeled as the third world, and now much more referred to as the developing world or the global South. So whether this is advocating for development or attempting to create more space for developing countries in the broader international system, having them be more represented, having international organizations that either they have more of a voice in, or more of a role in shaping the rules of those organizations. So that very much is part of the South-South cooperation dynamic. And then finally, protecting China's own sovereignty from the US. And this is something that I see as emerging over the last 10 years or so. This was mentioned in the report in a few different ways, but essentially in the global South and in countries that it has South-South cooperation with, wanting support for China's stance on issues in the South China Sea, or in relation to its behavior in Hong Kong, or Taiwan, which has been a long-standing issue. This is not a new phenomenon, but wanting diplomatic recognition of the PRC versus Taiwan, or as I said earlier, about its behavior in Xinjiang. So increasingly using South-South cooperation as a way to have countries in the global South support those initiatives. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that comprehensive outline of the PRC strategy. Anything to add, Kenton?
Yeah, I would say that, kind of on Dawn's comments, that we kind of focus in on this report on support for China in the international system. And to kind of pull out a couple of points, a key goal here is to, yes, facilitate action and support for China's initiatives, but also to, and equally as important, to inspire inaction. So kind of moving pieces out of the way, any potential obstacles for China's rise out of the way. So, this can come in the form of self-censorship, of abstaining from votes in the UN or in other multilateral forums, of not coming out and criticizing China on issues like Xinjiang, or abstaining from criticizing China like some countries in the West have done for it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So equally as important as having support for its initiatives, a desire to inspire inaction on some issues is also important in its strategy and goals.
Important dynamic to highlight there. Thank you. The next question: economic ties have been the principal entry point for China in many of these countries for reasons of China's own priorities and assets, as well as economic drivers on the recipient side that lead countries to seek Chinese investment and funding. What role does the Belt and Road Initiative play in China's engagement strategy, and how do countries in these regions view BRI participation? We'll start with Pepe.
Thanks, Caitlin, for that question, and thank you again for the DFRLab for the invitation, and congratulations on this fantastic report again. What a pleasure it is to share the panel with all of you. I'm going to try to limit some of my response, mostly focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the region I'm more familiar with, but hopefully in ways that resonates in other regions of the global South. At least in Latin America and the Caribbean, economic engagement, economic ties are just by far still the most important and most impactful channel of Chinese engagement. And our center has done a lot of work on this. We've done a few reports on, for example, Chinese investment in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'll be using LAC to quickly describe Latin America and the Caribbean, since it's a mouthful sometimes. And of course, some of the potential opportunities and risks involved in deal making with China. And last year we had a flagship report on the future of trade between China and the LAC region. And to answer your question about how BRI fits into that, I think it fits very nicely into this broader economic engagement that we see that China has with the region. And it is indeed, to your point, Caitlin, a two-way street in a sense that, yes, China is pushing that agenda, but we also see some demands and economic driver on the recipient side. I'll say that specifically infrastructure, the Latin American and Caribbean region has its own economic development needs, of course. It has deficient infrastructure and sometimes has trouble improving the infrastructure due to either financial or capacity constraints. And on the other side, you see Chinese investors and companies providing attractive options in that space. And sometimes, and this is important to highlight here, sometimes we don't really see a lot of Western firms either competing in this process or being truly competitive in this process. So the point of alternative is very important. And I think that leads me to the other question you asked, which is, how do countries in the global South, and I guess specifically in LAC, how do they look at the BRI? And I want to be perhaps slightly contrarian here. I do think that the ideological and the political aspect is very important, as the panelists mentioned in the response to the previous question. Perhaps being a little contrarian here, in our region, I see most of the countries not really regarding the BRI membership itself as an ideological political alignment. They see this more as a pragmatic economic consideration or decision for reasons I explained a little earlier, right? There's a need and there's the opportunity there. As of now, we have 20 countries in the region signed on to the BRI, and many of them are actually very explicit and open about BRI-related discussions in public. They say that we do not see it as a political statement. We actually very much welcome alternative proposals coming out of the US government, coming out of the European Union. And of course, indeed, we have seen some of these alternatives emerging over the past few years, Building Back Better world, and of course, the European Union's global gateway. But perhaps we can agree that none of these initiatives at this current stage has quite the scale to compete meaningfully, so to speak. And lastly, I guess just to make a quick tangent here, if I may, related to how the global South, how Latin America looks at the BRI initiative, I think it's important to also highlight perhaps their initiative and how the West looks at it, generally speaking. And this is an important point to make because in our conversation with regional government officials from Latin America and the Caribbean, they always bring this up. They don't necessarily see the BRI thing once again as a pro-China play or anti-West play. And sometimes the conversation gets a little interesting because they feel like the Western perception of China and BRI is often framed in that context. And this is sometimes detrimental to the US standing in the region in the sense that sometimes we see government officials complaining that it seems like your interest is much more focused on countering Chinese presence in the region rather than meaningful actions and concrete actions to support the regional economic development. So I think that's certainly something to keep in mind here.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we certainly see similar things at IRI throughout our work. Basically everywhere in the world we go about presenting this idea of alternatives for economic investment and engagement. So that definitely resonates. Dawn, what's the situation? What's the view from the Middle East and Africa? Are there commonalities with regard to the view from LAC? I would appreciate your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, so the way I look at Belt and Road in Middle East and Africa, in many ways, is the same way I look at Belt and Road globally, but I'll focus on Middle East and Africa. But it is China's vision for its role in the world, I would say more broadly, very much focused on connectivity. I know the question was around economic activity, but I do think it's important to highlight that Belt and Road, as it has been developing, especially in the global south, there's the economic components and the finance components and the people-to-people, but there's also a space Silk Road and a health Silk Road and a digital Silk Road, and there's many different functional areas. So very much the way in which China wants to connect the world. I also think it's important to highlight some of China's views regarding the links between economic development and stability, and very much seeing economic development and this type of connectivity ultimately creating a more peaceful environment both within states and between states in regions. Another important thing to highlight is that the vast majority of economic activity occurring in Middle East and Africa really predated Belt and Road, in that much of this started really in the early 2000s, looking at foreign direct investment and infrastructure and other projects. And although it's been amplified in the last several years, I see much of the activity that now is labeled as in Belt and Road really predated the 2013 Land Belt and Silk Road, as well as the 2015 Belt and Road itself. I see the foreign policy tools that China utilizes kind of more broadly in these regions, almost all of them ultimately as falling under Belt and Road in the economic sphere in particular, but also increasingly in the political sphere. So for example, the cooperation forums that we will discuss later have now been squarely placed under Belt and Road from a conceptual standpoint, right? And so finally, I see Belt and Road as a way in which China is leveraging all of its instruments of power, diplomatic, information, economic, and even military, if you think about the base in Djibouti, all of these instruments of power, leveraging them to achieve the goals that I mentioned in my first response to the original question regarding South-South cooperation. So I see it in this very expansive way, and geographically it including Middle East, Africa, Latin America, as well as Asia, the Arctic, and from the beginning, originally potentially could even include North America if the US and Canada were interested in being involved. So I see it in a much more global way. Thank you.
Great, thank you. As referenced in the report and in the conversation just now, China has deepened its presence in these multilateral forums in the global south in recent years. What can we say about the role that regional institutions play in China's engagement strategy? How do they facilitate China's goals in the region? How do they facilitate the goals of participating countries in their engagement with China? We'll start with Kenton.
Yeah, I'd say regional institutions are quite important to China because they help in, at least from the perspective of the report, in 4 kind of key arenas. They help institutionalize, publicize, socialize, and legitimize Chinese governance concepts and Chinese concepts for its model and norms. They help to set some level of standardization or themes for its engagement as a whole in the region, allows for more expedient agenda setting, and lowers the transaction costs that you would normally have with just engaging bilaterally. In the report, we look a lot at how these forums help institutionalize and codify Chinese legal and governance concepts. For example, language in some of the joint agreements, for example, in FOCAC or CELAC, include participating countries to support the One China principle. So for example, you can have language that talks about, agreeing to set up some kind of cooperation, and then also, you have countries saying, and blah, blah, blah supports the One China principle. And so what that does is that China can then kind of leverage this in other international forums like the UN during votes on issues related to its interests. And it sort of starts to build this connective tissue, or this legitimating layer that China can then draw on to get more concrete things. So for example, normalizing the idea that, so for the One China principle, normalizing the idea that Taiwan's sovereignty is kind of up for debate, helps to do some kind of narrative road clearing to, pave the way for when maybe, reunification or eventual reunification occurs. There's this institutional, legal, and normative socialization that has occurred beforehand, where there's an agreement among certain countries that Taiwan's not really a sovereign country. And you can kind of see this language too when China talks about Ukraine. For example, they say Ukraine and China and Taiwan are not the same thing. Ukraine's a sovereign country, and the implication is Taiwan is not sovereign. So some of these things are very subtle in the way in how they operate, but you can think of it as kind of layering, like creating the connective tissue that allows for, different kinds of expressions of power.
Okay, thank you. And over to Dawn. I know you have thoughts on this as well.
So the cooperation forums that I look at in my own research are the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, as well as the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum. But like the other cooperation forums globally, these institutions, they really are the primary multilateral mechanism that China uses to cooperate with countries in these regions across basically all functional areas. Today, I'll focus on political, economic, foreign aid, and security, but I think that the report that was released today does a nice job of highlighting some other interactions in the media sphere, but everything from people to people, education, health, etc., is covered under these forums. The political norms underlying these, and I'll cover it in a similar way to Kenton, but the norms first would be the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which is a very strict interpretation of Westphalian sovereignty, emphasizing sovereignty, non-interference, and non-intervention, as well as South-South cooperation. Another important normative underpinning for the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum would be support for the Palestinians. And this is different from, historically going back to the Mao era, there was a very strong PRC support for the Palestinians as part of a much broader anti-colonial support that they provided to groups globally. So that shifted ever since 1992. China has had strong relations with Israel as well as with the Palestinians and with other countries in the region. But part of the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum is voicing support for the Palestinians. And I would say the counterpart to that ties in with some of the other issues we've been discussing is Arab state relative silence regarding China's treatment of Uyghurs within China's own borders. So from a political standpoint, those are the underlying norms. On the economic front, there's a very heavy role for the state in economic activity, very similar to China's own domestic economy and its behavior globally on the economic front. In the foreign aid realm, that's a very important component, especially of FOCAC. A lot of foreign aid initiatives, both concessional loans, but also a very broad range of other types of grants and foreign aid. And I think most of the viewers will be very familiar with the fact that China may have some economic conditions associated with foreign aid, but the political conditionality, other than the obvious, One China principle, et cetera, there's not a political conditionality regarding good governance or other domestic political issues on the foreign aid front. Finally, I did want to make a quick comment on security cooperation. That's not something we've talked a lot today, but I think it's important in the cooperation forums. It's not a heavy focus compared to an organization like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but the ways in which security is dealt with is emphasizing peacekeeping, nuclear-free zones, wanting to have cooperation on counterterrorism efforts more broadly, but it very much focuses on China's desire to interact in multilateral ways, either within the forums or through the UN system or with the African Union to address security issues more broadly. But that's the way I see the cooperation forums. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Shifting specifically to China's discourse power, as the report notes and others have documented elsewhere, China has been more direct and explicit in recent years in exporting its authoritarian governance model to create a world safe for the CCP's rise. How central are China's discourse power efforts to this global strategy? I'll kick it to Kenton.
Yeah, I would say more so than seeking to have other countries emulate its model, China sees acceptance and approval of its model, our socialism with Chinese characteristics, as an important goal, as well as acceptance and approval of China's vision for, a more, as Don said, multilateral, multipolar international system as kind of the goal. So in this vein, discourse power efforts are pretty central to this goal. Discourse power refers to the ability to define Chinese actions and Chinese values on China's terms versus those of the West. And so those kind of four actions I mentioned earlier about, socializing, institutionalizing, publicizing, and legitimizing Chinese governance concepts can be thought of as that connective tissue that creates the conditions for China to create a world that's more, amenable to its rise. And this is because it both creates a kind of constituency of countries in the global South that China can draw on when it needs support for its global governance initiatives, or when it, alternatively wishes to stunt collective action against it, by Western countries. So, for example, censure over its failure to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it has this ability to, it's important for China's ability to both mobilize support and deny mobilization of potential adversaries.
Thank you. Efforts to control narratives are constantly evolving to respond to global events or address particular concerns of the PRC, as you noted. Has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted how these countries in the region engage with China? If so, how? I would love to hear your perspectives from LAC, Pepe.
Thanks, Caitlin. I think from a LAC perspective, I'll try to focus more specifically on vaccine diplomacy, which the report referred to, and also our center has also done some work related to that. Earlier this year, we released this publication trying to compare U.S. versus Chinese vaccine diplomacy in LAC. And I think one of the key findings here is exactly to your point, narratives really, really matter. And this might be a slight tangent, but I think, Chinese vaccine diplomacy it goes beyond just vaccine donations. And what we saw in this report that we did earlier this year across different countries, specific case studies, is that Chinese vaccine donations were often accompanied by or very quickly follow up by diplomatic actions and messaging. And this includes very high level stuff, including a call or video message from President Xi or senior Chinese officials. Whereas at the same time, we don't really quite see that coming from, for example, President Biden and the US government. And these are gestures that sometimes go a long way, and it helps strengthen China's discourse power and to help repair, to your point, I guess, repair China's image, which I think really took a hit at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think the other thing is, in terms of how this contributes to the evolving nature of the engagement with China, I would say that vaccine and broader health diplomacy broaden Chinese engagement with the region. And this is important in the LAC context because something we've noticed is that the relationship between China and LAC is generally speaking and relatively speaking more one-dimensional and focused more than anything else on the economic side of things. And this is very different, for example, the kind of relationship that the United States has with the region, which is more multidimensional, encompassing not just economic, but also deeper historic, cultural, interpersonal ties. So, and this is an important context to keep in mind because marginally speaking, vaccine and health diplomacy and the discourse aspect of it basically allow for China to have a more diversified and multidimensional relationship. It has so much more to gain through this additional new avenue to engage the region. And of course, this engagement goes both ways. It's not just for China to engage the region, but also vice versa. And I think, I guess my final point here about how this changes things is once again, going back to the earlier point I made about this perception gap that I always see in Latin America and perhaps the global South, how they perceive some of the Chinese actions versus the US/European and Western actions related to, in this particular case, vaccine diplomacy. There's also that at the height of the pandemic, especially when Chinese vaccine donations, and let's keep in mind that at this point, US vaccine donations in terms of numbers has far outstripped Chinese vaccine donations. But a lot of folks in the region still are living and keeping this impression from early stage of the pandemic where all the advanced economies were at least accused of hoarding vaccines, and China was one of the few countries that were exporting vaccines to the regions, and Chinese vaccines were the most competitive, in some cases, the only product available in these markets, going back to the earlier point, Caitlin, about alternatives. So I think the discourse power obviously is much more meaningful and convincing when there's action behind it, backing it. And I think the vaccine diplomacy is another point of how this discourse power that we're discussing is interacting with some of the more traditional or even innovative ways of diplomacy and engagement.
Great, thank you. That leads well into our next question, relating to how generally citizens in the Global South have responded. I'm curious if we've seen any evidence of shifts in public or elite perceptions or sentiments as a result of broader engagement from the PRC, whether political, economic, diplomatic, vaccines, sort of otherwise, that may create political pressure for support for China's positions and initiatives. And if not, what can we say about local engagement, local reactions to China's engagement in these regions, knowing that it is quite complex? So I think Pepe, I have some thoughts on that as well, following up on your previous answer.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. And I think, tying this question to a comment that I saw, a question I saw in the Q&A section about, the comment basically says that, we see growing economic ties between China and Latin America, but we don't see necessarily improved Latin American perception of Chinese government. So I think this ties nicely with your question, which is perhaps on one hand, we see growing Chinese discourse, intentional efforts, but it doesn't necessarily always translate into better results. And this is also an important point that Kenton had mentioned in her report as well. It's a complex question, and I think I don't have an answer to this question in particular, but I will say that this is a still evolving situation. And in general, I'll highlight that in our region, in LAC, the general, I would say at the public popular level, the knowledge of China and Chinese actions is still very much lacking. So I would take a grain of salt some of the numbers and the metrics we see in general. I would say that, especially at the government officials level, there's clearly growing interaction with China. They understand better about what's happening with China, but at the popular level, day-to-day knowledge of what China is doing, that's still that's incredibly lacking. And I will say that this actually speaks to the fact that China still runs a massive, I would say, soft power deficit in the region, I think around the world, vis-a-vis, let's say, the United States. And I think a lot of the public knowledge and impression about China, comes from basically more tangible stuff that folks can see and touch on a more day-to-day basis, that whether that's like a technological product, whether that's a Xiaomi phone, for example, in Latin America and the Caribbean, or you see a toll road built by Chinese companies. But I think the discourse power aspect of it is still very much underanalyzed. So once again, just congratulate Kenton and DFRLab for starting this very important work and certainly continuing along this discussion. And I think the second part of your question, coming to the point about more local reactions, I think, despite the fact that there is, to my earlier point, lack of, I would say, knowledge and strong impression or understanding of Chinese engagement and or opinion about it, I do think that this is an area to watch. We certainly see more, for example, subnational level engagement between Chinese officials and Latin American Caribbean officials. This obviously builds upon a lot of work that scholars, including ourselves, have done on the national level, country to country level, and that's certainly an area to watch. And I think it's the jury's still out whether or not this effort will successfully translate into some sort of winning hearts and minds across the global south. And that's something that, and also keep in mind, of course, that the pandemic and whatever posts we read obviously reflect probably not exactly the real-time feeling of things. And these are things that happened across time and probably will take a while to materialize opinion-wise. So with that, I'll quickly close my answer to this question.
Thanks very much. Yeah, IRI is currently in the process of finalizing 2 country case studies on Mexico and Brazil, and have also noted certainly this increase in subnational engagement, not just opened up in large part by vaccine diplomacy and investment, but increasingly in the political sphere as well. Anything to add to that, Kenton?
Yeah, just to kind of pivot off of a few of Pepe's good points. In some countries, well, it really depends. Okay, if you're trying to win hearts and minds versus, elite capture, what is the goal in this country? Do you need hearts and minds? A lot of times, no. Because to what degree does public opinion shape elite behavior in some of these countries with different governance models? Sometimes not a lot. So it does vary greatly by country. And, China has different objectives, and different parts of the party state are responsible for these, different objectives. For example, the International Liaison Department does a lot of the subnational kind of diplomacy. And the International Liaison Department is, works to publicize, party policies, and engages with political parties that are, friendly to China. You have mass media and broadcast media initiatives, propaganda, external propaganda, what China terms it, to kind of, try and win hearts and minds. Then you have, public diplomacy initiatives for more institutional efforts. So just to kind of piggyback off of what Pepe is saying, this is a very dynamic and differentiated process. And there's a strategy that, that is different for each country and for each different country conditions. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind.
Great, thanks so much. We'll close out this moderated discussion with a couple of questions about, so what do we do? And so what next? What, in your view, should be done from a research and or policy point of view in better understanding China's relationship with these regions in the global South, and therefore developing more sort of robust and dynamic responses beyond, addressing some of the challenges that you have outlined so far? We'll start with Dawn.
So I'll just use this as an opportunity to ask everyone on the call, if you're PhD students, if you're researchers, et cetera, we just need a lot more research in every angle. I would say we've had a very rich research tradition in Asia, studying China, et cetera, but at every level, whether you're an Africanist who's looking at China's presence within a country or in a specific part of the country, or looking at the League of Arab States, or trying to understand these broader regional perspectives, there just is a need for a lot more research and a lot more crosstalk between Africanists, Middle East specialists, China specialists, IR theorists, to really understand what's happening and the ways in which we can respond.
Pepe, your thoughts?
So I think on that note, perhaps tying into something I mentioned earlier, I think I'd love to see additional research, building on current research, of course, thinking through how we can bridge that perception gap that I mentioned about how some of the regions in the global South looks at China and China's discourse power, and how in the West or in the US and Europe folks looks at it. And I think there's a lot of work that could be done on that front. And relatedly, something I would highlight is, we do a lot of this in our center, focusing on Latin America and the Caribbean, of course, is thinking about this more through the lens of just bring the regional perspective and think about it through the lens of regional agency and ability, and fully recognizing that the report that's launched today is, of course, a building stone, and of course, much more can be done going forward. But thinking through, why is it that despite some of the concerns that U.S. government and other partners and allies around the world have expressed about China, including concerns in local countries about some of the Chinese activities, countries by and large still continue to work with China? I think it's important to understand some of that in that perspective, and of course not portray countries and regions in the global South as just completely powerless actors. I think we need to acknowledge that these are also well researched, well thought out decisions, and they have their own objectives they need to accomplish through their engagement with China. I would say that would add an interesting layer to the research there. And if I could maybe add a final point is perhaps also something I had alluded to earlier, which is the discourse power discussion is such an important conversation, and I think in a way it's almost automatically focused on some of the political and ideological aspect of it. So combining that with some of the existing research on the economic front, on the traditional means and channels diplomacy, I think it adds even more richness to this conversation. But of course, finalized by saying that congratulations again to this excellent report, and hoping to see upcoming work.
So Kenton, the report obviously closes with a note about more research to be done. So would love to hear your thoughts on the priorities in that space as well.
Yeah, I would just say I wholeheartedly agree with my fellow panelists. This report was focused on how China thinks about the global South, but that shouldn't, that shouldn't be to say that these regions do not have agency. Two kind of themes that both Pepe and Don mentioned that I kind of want to pull out. One is that China is providing very real solutions here to very real issues. Two, China is recognizing the agency and giving face to many of these countries in a way that the US has not. Thinking of vaccine diplomacy, China was supplying much needed vaccines to countries that were, that at the same time saw Western countries hoarding vaccines even when they had a surplus. And China was able to take advantage of this to, engage in pretty successful PR campaigns. So I would say that the framing of policy vis-a-vis the global South here tends to focus too much sometimes on competition between the US and China. Meanwhile, China is providing real solutions to issues. So coming up with, thinking through solutions-based approaches to engagement with the global South, I think would go a long way. And it can't just be about competition with China. It's not good enough, and it's not really speaking to the needs of these countries in a way that will resonate and actually achieve the goals that we want to achieve in, countering Chinese influence in these regions.
Thank you all for that dynamic discussion. And now we are going to begin to answer some questions from the audience. Thanks to those who have already put questions in the Q&A box. And if you have additional ones, please keep them coming. To start, a question regarding China's influence on the global South and its impact on the environment climate crisis in countries in the South and the reemergence of diseases from other countries back in China. Any thoughts on sort of the environmental dynamic of China's engagement? Whoever would like to start.
I'll make a very brief comment. I don't look at this deeply, but definitely through the cooperation forums, there has in recent years been a lot of focus on green energy, on developing alternate energy sources, so that's a big element of cooperation between China and Arab states in particular. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the Middle East also, there's a number of initiatives within those forums to try to deal with water scarcity or, other potential ramifications of global warming. But I don't look in a detailed way at broader international environmental negotiations.
That's a good point, Caitlin.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So I think a quick point here I'd love to make, kind of just bring home, also driving home the point that Ken and I made earlier about taking into consideration just, domestic and just regional considerations in some of these discussions, and that countries are facing real issues and they're willing to work with whoever is providing the real solutions, whether that's the US and China. I think, when we look at how the global South thinks about a lot of the climate related issues, they have some of the shared challenges with China that don't necessarily share with some of the more advanced economies in the world. And you see similar concerns and complaints coming out of, global regions across the global South about basically developed countries were able to grow through this very, high polluting industrialization model. And that now you're cutting this off and we're basically left hand to dry. And it tells me something, for example, not being an India expert, but knowing the fact that China and India, when it comes to foreign policy, barely agrees on anything, but can vote very, uniformly on some of the climate issues. And I think we, take into consideration, of course, the discourse aspect of it, but let's not fool ourselves that, discourse is the only thing that's convincing countries to align with China, and that there's probably deeper and once again, sometimes very well thought out reasons for them to do that, and take that into consideration. I think it's very important to inform whether it's research, future research, and policy making as well.
Great, thank you. I just add that, we have seen in our work in partnering with civil society activists and others throughout the globe that environmental concerns are actually a driving force of activism in many of the countries where China's investment is prevalent, whether it's in mining or in economic development in the Amazon or things like that. So just add that point that I think it is increasingly a part of the dialogue around engagement with China and economic investment. All right, next question. How does Taiwan's push for a larger international presence, in essence, for discourse power compared to the same efforts by China in the global South? For example, the Taiwan Can Help effort during the start of COVID. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I'll just say it's not quite addressing the question, but one aspect that we highlighted in the report about China's engagement in the Latin America region was that this kind of desire to shift diplomatic recognition away from Taiwan to China. And I believe, out of the, I think, 14 or so countries that still recognize Taiwan, about 8 of them are in Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's kind of a focus for China in these regions. And I would say, China has immense tools at its disposal especially compared to Taiwan. And so I would say that it doesn't really compare in terms of, like what Taiwan can accomplish versus China. At the same time, you do see, other countries holding out, switching diplomatic recognition, but, it could be, as, Pepe mentioned, this kind of in their interest to maybe leverage that for maybe, more to get more aid from China or, more better conditions in, cooperation agreements or something with China. So that's what I would say about that.
I can add a quick point there, Caitlin. Sorry for doing this again. So I think on the last side, just tagging along what Kenton was saying, we saw some recent switches from Taiwan to China in recent years in our region. And one interesting case, and this is not the only case study here, is, for example, Paraguay, which is a Taiwanese ally in South America, and what we did, and there's a New York Times article that was put in last year, basically discussing this particular issue, which is countries are really trying to demonstrate their agency and exercise their agency through this competitive dynamics they see on the global stage. And in this case, whether it's U.S., China, or Taiwan, in multiple occasions, the Paraguayan government was very intelligently maneuvering this dynamics, and by saying that if we're not getting vaccines from the U.S. or its allies, if Taiwan cannot substantially support us in this fight against the pandemic, we got to think about other options. And I think from my perspective, that's a very smart way of getting people's attention and making sure that countries are getting the resources they need to fight the pandemic. And let's not forget that the pandemic may or may not be more of a black swan one-off event, but going forward, a lot of parts of our region, I think a lot of countries in the global South, are disproportionately impacted by climate events. And I would say that certainly will need growing international assistance going forward. So I would not be surprised to see this sort of strategy and the agency on the regional perspective from the regional part to continue to grow.
Anything to add to that, Dawn?
I would just say I think this is a much more live issue in Latin America. In the Middle East, there are no countries that recognize Taiwan. In continental Africa, Eswatini is the only one. And it's really even shifting more. A few years ago, there was an incident where the Kenyan government extradited a number of Taiwanese citizens to the PRC in a legal case, which it was related to cyber crimes. It's a very complicated story, but the fact that they chose to extradite them to the PRC rather than sending them back to Taiwan, which is where their citizenship was, I think is a good example of China has kind of the overwhelming power in the narrative related to that issue that's been growing over time. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll have time for 1 or 2 more questions. This might be beyond the scope of this panel, but I'll ask it anyway. Have you studied how China's discourse uses various cognitive bias strategies? For example, Pepe alluded to a Chinese discourse advantage from earlier messaging on vaccines, which set an anchor bias towards vaccine efforts. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I can quickly jump in since I was, mentioned here. So I think I'll answer this question by looking at a different way, which is how the U.S. can more effectively respond to some of these challenges. And I think it's very important to think about what are some of the existing efforts, once again, that the U.S. is undertaking, and how can you combine the U.S. discourse power to that narrative and to these actions. One opportunities I see, for example, the question asked about mentioned how China was able to capitalize on its vaccine donations and build vaccine diplomacy and messaging around it. I think there's a huge, massive opportunity for the United States in the coming month, next month, in fact, in the Summit of Americas, which will be held in LA. For the first time, the US is hosting this hemispheric conference in a very long time, and it's an excellent opportunity to enhance US leadership. And our center is doing a lot of work related on that. But I do think that an intelligent way of competing with China is not necessarily about being anti-China in the region, but more about pro-region, making sure that once again that the U.S. action efforts are aligned with economic development goals, national interest in the countries, and ensure that the discourse power plays a very constructive role in that process.
Thanks. That's a really important point. I mean, I think, regardless of the efforts a lot of us take to center this discussion really as a regional discussion or country level discussion about the path that the country takes, inevitably it always gets wrapped up in this idea of broader geopolitical competition, which is not necessarily always conducive to the right kind of debate that we are hoping to have in some of these countries. So I appreciate that point. Okay, final question with regard to debt. Is Beijing simply opportunistically using sort of issues around debt and repayment that have grown in the last 10 years to exert political influence, for example, in getting support for votes at the UN on Xinjiang, on one-China policy, et cetera? Or was this more of a deliberate policy from the outset or strategy from the outset to use economic entry points for exerting political influence? Probably most prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa. If you have any thoughts, Dawn.
So my primary, this could be a day-long discussion, right, regarding this one issue, so I think that there are some. I think the discussion over debt trap diplomacy, et cetera, tends to be exaggerated on the US side. I think there are some problematic issues associated with debt for countries, regardless of who they're borrowing from, that can give some asymmetric advantages to other countries. What I can say is what I've seen over the last several years is I think the PRC has become very sensitive to these accusations, and especially in countries in the sub-Saharan Africa, both from a rhetoric and a discourse standpoint, are trying to emphasize that is not their intent. And they're also taking, I would say, concrete actions to try to ensure projects are more sustainable. And that, in some cases, at the beginning of COVID, you even had a number of loans, the actual debts were forgiven for some of the least developed countries in the region. And this ties into a very long history that China has of forgiving debt and other actions. But my biggest comment on this was, I think, regardless of what the original intent was, and I think it's very hard to know intent because it's not a transparent system, regardless of the original intent, I do think they're modifying their behavior. And you're seeing that in the cooperation forums, you're seeing it in a number of Belt and Road projects, that they don't want the perception on the ground to be that that's what they're attempting to do. So they're trying to change the terms of some of those agreements to better align with sustainability for the local governments. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Perhaps another area for further research as well. I know some scholars have looked into this connection between economic investment and voting patterns at the UN. I can't recall off the top of my head, but certainly it's a complex topic. So I'm sure there's more to be looked at there, particularly as this is the whole conversation around debt is very much live and evolving in many of these countries. So. Great. Well, with that, I'd just like to thanks the audience for being here, for these really helpful questions, to all of the panelists for taking the time and for your thoughtful responses. Congratulations again to DFRLab and Kenton for this report. Obviously a lot of discussion to continue, and so we're looking forward to continued engagement. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.